where we came from is in fact going to be found in Sumer, ancient Sumer. Modern day Iraq, Tigris-Euphrates River, Zagros Mountains, the Fertile Crescent. And the Sumerians are the first great culture that we know to come out of the Stone Age. At around 6,000 years ago, they appear full-blown, boop, everything. Over 100 of the first that we attribute to a high culture the Sumerians produced. Now, logic would tell you, and certainly the Darwinian paradigm of simplicity leading to ever more complexity would tell you that the first culture out of the Stone Age is going to come crawling out of the caves on bloody hands and knees. Are they not? But no. These guys come sailing out and start building beautiful cities and have education and law and everything. Next slide, please. They had the first great cities, the first great city centers, the first high-rise buildings, the first walls, the first roads, the first wheeled vehicles, the first ocean-going vessels, geniuses with water, first agriculture, first animal husbandry, first laws, first court systems, first literature. You name it. They had it. Well, everything except cable TV, maybe. I mean, they had it. They were great. They were a fantastic culture. And the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans come from their culture. Those cultures developed from what passes down from the Sumerians, or at least out from the Sumerians, I believe. Okay? So, one of the many things they had at first was writing. Now, this is what we're all taught. We're taught nothing about the Sumerians except that they invented writing. Again, they appear, boop, invent writing, boop, disappear, and that's it. History forgets about them. You never hear what they wrote. You never hear what they wrote. And you never hear how sophisticated they were because, again, it doesn't fit that paradigm. It's easier to just start with the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans and move on from there. Okay? What they had to say, next slide, in their writings, their writing, by the way, was cuneiform, very sophisticated math-based writing. And by the way, their mathematical system, called sexagesimal, based on the number 60, is better than ours for using very small numbers and very large numbers. And they kept time around the great year, 26,000 years. How'd they figure that out? Among other things. But in their writings, most of it is like these little hand things where it's just bills of lading. I sell you this. I'm buying that from you. It's like our paperwork. But they have a lot of them, about 5,000 of the 100,000 or more that we have, that have to do with stories of their cosmology, their cosmogony, their history, where we came from, how the solar system formed and all that. And that's what we're going to go over, what they had to say. Where did it come from? Well, originally when these things were being translated in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the translators would read what they'd have to say, it was like, oh, come on, forget about it. Put them in the myth. These are myths. They have to be myth. It can't be true. And they put it in the myth pile, which Alan was talking about, myth. So, Zechariah Sitchin, a man named Zechariah Sitchin in the 1950s gets the idea, wait a minute, how does the first culture get a myth? Who hands it to them? Good question. Why didn't anybody else think of that? So, he assumes it has to be a history. They have to be telling a history, which then later gets distorted perhaps as myth by later cultures, but the first one's got to be a history. So he goes into the myth pile with that attitude and comes out with 8 books at this point called the Earth Chronicles series, which I use as the basis for a lot of what you're going to see here now for a while. Okay, we're going to go over what the Sumerians had to say, boiled down. Part 4 of my book is basically the cliff notes to Sitchin's work. Any of you that have tried to read it, you know it's a slog at points. Okay, I tried to make it as easy as I could so at least you have the cliff notes to go in and try it again. All right, next slide. Here's what they say, that originally as the solar system was forming, there was the Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, and a big planet called Tiamat, right where the asteroid belt is now. And if you know about Bode's law, there's supposed to be planets at certain places of a certain size, and it all fits reasonably well except for the asteroid belt where there should be a planet, and there isn't. But there was Tiamat then, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto as a moon of Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and into that forming solar system at around 4 billion years ago, which we extrapolate and assume because all of them were still very plasmid, still very much lava-ish, able to pull moons out of themselves, and we know that the solar system formed at around 4.6 billion years ago, so at around 4 billion years ago would have been the time approximately when this would have happened. Okay, Nibiru comes in, and as it's a stray planet like the one we saw a few months ago being slung out of the binary star system on the news. We all saw that. Probably something like that. It's captured by the gravitational pull of the large outer planets, swung around the sun, captured by the sun, and is caught in an elliptical orbit like a comet, moving clockwise as opposed to the counterclockwise circles of the other planets. Well, as you can see, there's the capacity for real problems here with one going one way and one going the other. And in the second time around, Nibiru collides head-on with Tiamat at planetary speeds. This is a collision. Okay? Next slide. This whole thing now is described in the great Sumerian epic of creation called the Enuma Elish, which is 6 tablets of action, 1 tablet of summation, which is taken to be by many people the basis for the 6 days of creation and the 1 day of rest. Because much of the Old Testament is a direct come down from the Sumerians. And if you know the Sumerian history and you read your Sitchin, you will know that, or my stuff, you will see that that is the case. Now, in that great epic of creation, the Enuma Elish, six of the major puzzles of modern astronomy and Earth geology are, I think, plausibly answered. You heard Alan's interpretation of some of it. I'm going to give you mine and give you the basic Sitchin explanation. Okay? What they say is that in the collision, Nibiru slams into Tiamat. It is a little more held together. It's older, and so it is coalesced more. It holds together. Tiamat is shattered in two, blown apart, torn in half. And that the lighter outer crust, the crust with the water on it, is scattered in all directions. Boom, just an explosion, the lighter crust, and goes off with the water. Now, one of the great mysteries of modern-day astronomy is comets. Comets make no sense for this reason. They come from all over the place. In a linear universe, when, you know, the great ball of a primordial cloud of dust and gas swirling around flattens out into a pancake to make the solar system, that's the ecliptic. Everything formed in the ecliptic should be in the ecliptic. Nothing should be out of the ecliptic, and yet comets come from all over the place. So they had to be removed out to where they are some kind of way, but we don't have any idea. So they come up with this fantastic thing called the Oort cloud, which is so far away you can't imagine. The Oort cloud is one of the biggest jokes out there. And that's how they explain comets, because they can't explain them any other way. But the problem with comets is they have water in them. And anything out in space is not going to produce water. You produce water by being a cooling planet with lava spewing up the steam and stuff like that, and it condenses, etc. So comets have to begin in a planet. Now, this explains it, I think, plausibly well. Nothing that they will throw at you to explain comets will do it. All right, number 2, the other great mystery, the asteroid belt. What they say is that the inner viscous magma inside Tiamat in the collision was strung out the bowels of the planet. The guts were ripped out and strung out and broke into little pieces. That's the asteroid belt. They called it the hammered bracelet. We call it the asteroid belt. But there it is. And that's a fairly plausible explanation for it. Again, this doesn't make sense because, as you heard, the exploded planet theory. Problem is, when a planet explodes, it ought to just go boom everywhere. It shouldn't be hanging around. Doesn't make sense for a number of reasons. Okay, now, the third one is Pluto. Pluto's a problem because it's, as you've all been hearing lately, they're trying to downgrade it. It doesn't belong. It doesn't fit. It has an orbit that's not like the others. It carries inside the orbit of Neptune, and it's 17 degrees off the ecliptic. Again, nothing should be off the ecliptic. What they say is that Nibiru, as it swung around, it pulled Pluto away from Saturn, its original home, and dropped it out where it is now. Now, all astronomers know Pluto is not a natural planet. It started life as a moon of an inner planet. They know that. But they have no idea how it could have gotten moved out to where it is. Here you go. Here's the reasonable answer right here. Now, let's talk about Earth. 3 great mysteries here. Life. Well, first of all, let's establish that Earth is a remnant of this. What happens is Nibiru's moon bangs into the remnant of Tiamat, and like pool balls, boop, hitting, knocks it inside the orbit of Mars, and it reestablishes there and becomes the Earth, the remnant of Tiamat. Now, Earth has one great mystery is life. How did life come to be? Life appears, despite what you're told about the lightning bolt into the primordial soup and all that, forget it. That's just a joke. That's just a fantasy fairy tale to tell people that don't want to know the truth and to tell kids in school. That's what they're teaching to this day. We know very well that the first forms of life to appear on Earth appear suddenly. They're very sophisticated bacteria, prokaryotic bacteria, and there's not one, there's two kinds, and they appear at around 4 billion years ago. Suddenly, overnight, strata with two kinds, sophisticated bacteria, relative to what that first living form would have been. If I had done the first part of my show, you would see all that. Okay, you can get the tape or get one tape and put it in a room and let everybody see it if you want to. But anyway, the point is, life is a great mystery. How it would suddenly appear 4 billion years ago, here you go. It says in the tablets, in the collision between Nibiru and Tiamat, in the mingling of their waters, Nibiru passed life to Tiamat, to the remnant of Tiamat. Perfect explanation for the sudden appearance of two sophisticated life forms on the remnant. Now, the remnant now is over here with its moon Kingu and has gone over, and now we're looking at two major differences in Earth and all other astral bodies out there. Earth is missing a huge portion of its crust, and it has plate tectonics, movement in the plates. How could that happen? No explanation. Why? Because in the vacuum, any liquid in a vacuum, what does it do? You see it in the space shuttle all the time. They let orange juice or milk. It makes the smallest, tightest ball it can make. That is what a liquid does in a vacuum. Smallest, tightest ball it can make. Now, that is what all the other astral bodies have done. They don't have plate tectonics. There's nowhere for the plates to go. They're as tight as they can be. Where do plate tectonics come from? In the collision, the backside of Tiamat is cracked like an eggshell. Cracked like an eggshell. There are the plates. There are the plates. And when the missing crust, of course, is when the half is there. It's still viscous. It's still magma. So what's it going to do? It's going to tighten itself down into a new ball, much smaller than the old one had been. And what's going to happen? It's going to have a big chunk gone, a big missing piece of itself, a big hole in itself, in its skin. And so that scar is going to break up into pieces as the plates move around, and we have the plate tectonics and we have the missing surface that we know about today. Next slide, please. And we'll take a look at just a representation of what it looks like with the water gone. Not to scale, of course, but you get the idea. This is not like any other planet or moon out there. Something happened. And I think the Enuma Elish gives a plausible explanation for what that was and for all the other things that I mentioned as well. Next slide. Now, when the dust settled, here's what we had. The solar system as we know it today, with Nibiru moving in this clockwise 3,600-year orbit. And I say it passes outside the orbit of Mars, inside the inner edge of the asteroid belt. And the last time through, I think, was around 200 BC, which means it's just past aphelion out here, and it's going to be back around 3400 AD, about 1400 years. We don't have to worry about it if I'm right. You will get arguments about these dates. Some people use textual interpretations. I use the date of the ending of the Ice Age, which I believe was caused by Nibiru passing through and lifting the tides. You can read about why I think that in the book. And I use the dating of the ice cores and the tree rings of science. I try to make my work as scientifically based as I can because I expect someday to be able to go toe-to-toe with those guys, and I want to be able to do it on their turf in their terms. Okay? So, next slide. All right. This is some of the proof for that story that you've just heard, and it starts with cylinder seals. And I just want you to see what a cylinder seal is. There are about 5,000 of these that we have. They're with their printing press. It was just a thing they would roll out on the clay to leave little pictures like this. Now, when they had a story to tell, they told it in the tablets like you saw. But when they had an event that everybody would know the event, like I showed you that cartoon, and everybody here, we all knew in a very small space that was talking about millions of words and thousands of volumes about evolution. Am I right? We all knew. Well, they would all know this was the story of the time the gods or whoever gave the water to the water buffalo or whatever. The point is, notice the fine detail in the best of the cylinder seals, and then realize that these are basically 2 to 3 inches high. They're like big spools of thread. made out of precious and semi-precious stone, carved in a circular format so that they roll out flat and three-dimensionally. Now, when asked how this was done, science says, well, they could only have bored little holes into the rock and then abraded them out like they, to the degree that they wanted. Well, the sand would be bigger than the holes you need to do this, some of this work anyway. There's just no way. Lasers, this is not even an inch square here. Lasers would have a hard time doing this if they could do it. Nobody knows how they did this. They're just pulling one out of the hat on you. Okay, next slide. This is the one I want you to see. This is a much older one, much more worn, as you can see. 4,500 years, 4,500 years, 2,500 BC. It's called it's VA 243. It's in a museum in Berlin. It's well dated. And it's called the Granting of the Plow. This is a seated God. See him in his chair with a plow in his hand. And this is a standing God, and this is a human. How do we know they're gods? Because they have horns on their helmets. Horns on their helmets. Notice the horns. This is how you signify gods, or they did anyway, the Sumerians did on their cylinder seals. And I want you to pay special attention to this because later at the banquet we might see a real live Anunnaki helmet. We might see that. Okay, now, normally they would put astronomical signs up here to indicate who the god was because not everybody would know. But in this one, obviously everybody knew. And as you can see, this the human is carrying this kind of skunky old digging stick that the most primitive people have, even to this day. And this new wooden plow here, 4,500 years ago, we can go to Egypt today and see this very plow, and in many other third world countries still being used, this very plow. Okay, so no question it's the granting of the plow. But this is what makes this special right here. Let's see a blow-up of that. What is this? Solar system, right. Sun, Mercury, Venus, Earth, in their relative sizes, mind you. Earth, Moon, think how small that is. What grain of sand dug that out? Mars, and then, what should be here? This should be the asteroid belt. This is Nibiru, folks. Nibiru. Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto as a moon of Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. Notice that it's only a little bit bigger than Uranus, Neptune. It's about 3 times bigger than Earth. Nibiru is a good-sized planet. Good-sized planet, according to this. Okay? Now, again, what proof do we have of any of this? Let's take some look. Let's take a look at this. All right, here's a look at the solar system that you don't get to very often. And did it occur to any of you that we were looking at a cylinder seal carved at 4,500 years ago that had Uranus in it that we only discovered in 1781 when our telescopes got good enough to see it? It had Neptune, when we discovered in 1846 when our telescopes got good enough to see it, and Pluto, which we discovered in 1930 when our mathematicians got good enough to tell our astronomers where to look for the thing because it was so small. What are the Sumerians doing knowing about that? Furthermore, what are they doing writing in one of their tablets that if you look at these two, Uranus and Neptune, in the heavens, meaning right out on them, they look like blue-green watery twins? When we didn't find that out, we thought they were just big old gas bags like Jupiter and Saturn until Voyager went out there in 86 and 89 and found that, lo and behold, they really are blue-green watery twins. What the Sumerians said 4,500 years ago. Furthermore, they didn't count the way we do. Earth was not the third rock from the sun for them. It was number 7. So that means they were counting from out here and they were putting Pluto in its correct place. What are they doing with all that knowledge? Well, they make no bones about it. They say everything that we know, everything that we are, everything that we have comes from the people living on Nibiru. The people living on Nibiru came to Earth and gave us everything that we have, everything that we know, our great culture. Now, what's the proof of that? Is there any proof that any ancient advanced civilization was ever on Earth at any point in the dim or distant past? Yes, yes. The megalithic structures out there, the pyramids, Tiwanaku, Baalbek, Teotihuacan, Stonehenge, you name it. A couple of dozen of them. All of those are impossible for human beings to recreate today. And yet we are told in another one of these great fantasies that they were somehow created by people in ancient times, ancient Egyptians or ancient Sumerians or anybody. Somehow or other they did it. And it's just absolute malarkey. Impossible. Now, next slide. Some Egyptian scholars tried to prove it by getting down in with some pink granite here and wailing away with some stones for a few hours and tore their hands up and walked out of there saying, well, you know, we couldn't make much of a dent in it, but boy, you know, those old folks, they sure had a lot of time on their hands, and somehow they figured out a way to do it. Wouldn't give an inch after this. Wouldn't give an inch. It's ridiculous. Now, here's the stone they're working on. Next slide. Some of you may have seen this. This is an ancient 1,170-ton obelisk lies unfinished at the Aswan quarry. A crack rendered the stone unusable. It's pink granite. They were making it into an obelisk like the one you saw in Allen's slides. Okay? It's about 100 feet long. It's about 12 feet wide, 12 feet deep on the side. Imagine the Washington Monument just squared off. And it's pretty much done. But now let's move this from the Stone Age. Let's move it through the age of copper, because copper wouldn't make a dent in that. And let's move it into the Bronze Age. Bronze will chip on it. Bronze will take a little bit of it out. Now, let's put our bronze chisels or hatchets or whatever in the hands of some guys and get them down in this crack and put them to work. How do you think you're going to fare in there? Pretty tight fit. Plastic Man might have a tough time up in there. But the point is, they've got it pretty much done. They're working on the spire here. When they break it, you know how it works. You press here, you get this. Well, look, does this look like somebody chipping away with a little hand? No, this looks like a belt sander taking pieces out the size of the chair you're sitting on. Huge chunks of pink granite, one of the hardest stones in the world, just being ripped out. And they press too hard with whatever machine they've got here, and you know your physics. You get stress back here, and they popped it. They broke it. And they just said, whoops, we busted that one. And they just unhooked it and went somewhere else and left it for us to marvel at and wonder how they could have done it. But now let's go ahead and say they didn't bust it and they finished it. These primitive people now who managed somehow to do this. They finished it. It's ready to go. The hole, by the way, is about 15 feet deep. That's the top of it up there. But still, what's the first thing they've got to do? Somebody's got to draw straws to get down there with his hatchet and cut it loose from the bottom. Now, who's going to do that with 1,100 tons sitting on top of him? We could not get our best diamond-tipped blades to cut through underneath this thing. The weight would stop the blade. We could not, the operative word here is impossible. We could not get this out of here. And yet they did it time and time and time again. To lift it out, just if we could somehow cut it loose, we would have to take a dozen of our largest movable cranes to wring that hole just to get it up. You're being lied to, folks. That's the main thing you got to understand. You're being lied to. It's absolutely impossible for this one stone. This one stone proves that none of the megaliths were made by those people in that era. And this, again, is not the biggest one. They have them in Baalbek twice that big. Okay? Next slide. All right. What we're told is that the Anunnaki came to Earth for this, gold, mining gold. And that originally the story is they landed in ancient Sumer, but not 6,000 years ago, 400,000 years ago, 430,000 approximately to be exact. 400,000 years ago they land in modern-day Iraq, and they set up shop in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, and they call their home away from home, their home away from Nibiru, the Eden. You'll see a poster out there by my thing, Anunnaki over Eden. That's what that means. Because that poster is the Tigris River Valley that the symbol is rising above. That is where it was. That is where Eden was, according to them, and that comes down in the Bible as such. So they set up camp and they placer mined the gold out of those rivers. What do they need gold for? They needed to repair their atmosphere. In their rise to high technology, they had damaged that big, 3 times the size of Earth atmosphere, the same exact way we're damaging ours in our rise to high technology, and they ultimately had to repair it with very fine particulates of gold, like talcum powder, blown up into the stratosphere above it so it would ride above there and act as a reflector and an insulator from cosmic rays, which is, you see that on the masks of astronauts and in the capsule and all that. Gold is a wonderful stopper of cosmic rays. So that's what they had to repair it with. It's what we will have to repair it with. We'll have to do exactly the same thing when the day comes for us to have to face up to what we're doing to our planet. Okay? So they came, they placer mined out of the river, and all that is you put a tray in the water, you let the water sweep over, the water drops the gold into these cloth. Every few weeks you pick it up, and it's real easy. It's the way we do it now when we have the opportunity. But you tap out any stream system, ultimately, and they did. After about 150,000 years, they had tapped it out. And so they decided they were going to split themselves up and go where the mother lode of gold was on the planet Earth, which is what it is today, southern Africa. So they divided themselves into the upper world, which remained the Eden, and the Abzu, which was the lower world, and you didn't want to go to the lower world because you had to get in the holes and dig the gold. And they didn't like it. So the Anunnaki revolted. They said, we don't want to do this. We want a slave to do this work for us. Plus, it was a hardship duty, mostly men. Why don't you make us some women while you're at it? So that's what they did. They decided to use the creatures of Earth, which would be the hominoids, and I say it would have been the Almas, the likeliest candidate. They took the creatures of Earth to get some of their genetic material to make the new slave better adapted physically to the planet than they were, but the slave would for the most part be like themselves. We shall make the Adamu, A-D-A-M-U, which comes down as Adam, and we shall make the Adamu in our own image after our own likeness, which comes down word for word. And that is what they did. They made their slave inferior models of themselves. That's us, folks. That's us. We're really inferior models of the Anunnaki. And as you saw in the cylinder seal, we look like them. We look like, in their own image after their own likeness. In all of the cylinder seals, we look just like them. We don't have the horns on our headgear. That's about it. We are them. That's why we're not adapted to this planet. That's why we're so obviously not a part of this planet. We have their bones. We don't have primate bones. We have their muscles. We don't have primate muscles. We have their skin. We don't have primate skin. We have their body pattern, their hair patterns on their body is ours. We have thickest on our front, thinnest on our back. Primates have thick on the back, thin on the front. We have their eyes, their poor night vision eyes. We have their foreheads. We have their brains. That's the key to this. We have their brains. That's why we're not like anything else on this planet. We are them. We are genetically engineered copies of them. Okay, next slide. Let's take a look at how that was done. Human body contains 100 trillion cells. There's a nucleus inside each human cell except red blood cells. Each nucleus contains 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs. One chromosome of every pair is from each parent. The chromosomes are filled with tightly coiled strands of DNA. Genes are segments of DNA that contain instructions to make proteins, the building blocks of life. This is where genetic engineering takes place. Now, we're going to go over it lightly, but it's very important. I want you to understand these things that I'm going to tell you now. Okay, next slide. Don't worry about the details and how they do it. This is what they do. They can open up a cell, our genetic engineers can, our geneticists can. We can open up a cell, open up the nucleus, pull out strands of DNA, and in that strand, 98% of it will be what's called junk DNA. We don't know what it does. If it has a function, we don't know what it is. 2% will be what are called, prosaically enough, the working segments. They work. They do what they're supposed to do. They make the proteins. Now, if you cut in the junk above a working segment and in the junk below and remove it and have done the same with another strand of DNA over here, you can move anything into anything else. It can be animal into plant, plant into animal, fish into fowl. It does not matter because all living things at the most fundamental level are exactly alike. Understand that. We're all made of the same 4 base pairs, the same 20 amino acids. Everything is the same at the most basic level. It's like it's pop beads that are interchangeable. It is almost as if somebody designed it that way so they could just mix and match the parts and make anything they wanted. Isn't it? Something to think about. Okay, but the problem with it from an engineering standpoint is this. You're not cutting with a blade. These are not precise cuts. The blade would have to be a few molecules thick. You're cutting with chemicals. Chemicals. Now, the chemicals can cut pretty accurately, but mistakes are going to happen. Something's going to ooze out where it doesn't belong. Something's going to splash over it where it doesn't belong. Mistakes are going to happen. Inevitable. We know that. We make mistakes all the time. Another problem with genetic engineering is you don't know what you're going to get when you do this. You can't predict. You have to decide what you're going to do. You have to do it. You have to let it express, which is live, and see what you get, and then use that to determine what you do the next time. And of course, the great fear in genetic engineering is somebody's going to make a mistake and create the Andromeda strain that's going to kill us all. A legitimate concern. Although everybody's very careful, and I'm not too worried about it. But mistakes do happen because all of this is so incredibly microscopic. It's out of the nucleus of your cells, imagine how microscopic it is. But don't try to figure it out. I can't even figure it out. It's really complex. But they do it. Okay, understand that. Now, with that in mind, let's look at some of the proofs that I say indicate very clearly that we are, in fact, what the Sumerians say, a genetically engineered species by the Anunnaki. Next slide. Okay, here we go. The cerebral cortex is the deeply convoluted surface region of a brain that is most strongly linked to intelligence, lower right. It's the stained part out here. If you peel that off of the brain of a rat, it will cover a postage stamp. Peel it off of a monkey, it'll cover a postcard. Peel it off a chimp, it'll cover a sheet of typing paper. Peel it off of us, and it'll cover 4 sheets of typing paper. Now, you can see this is a transition. This is clearly a transformation. Now, there's some weird things about it. These guys are using all they've got. All they've got. We're using 1/2 of one page in a very different way than they are using what they have. 1/2 of one page. How do we know? We all know. We use about 10% of our brains. We know that from the studies done with idiot savants. You know that. And we know there are thousands of miles of neural network in our heads not being used. We don't know why. We don't know why. I'll tell you why. We shall make the atom move strong but not too strong, smart but not too smart. They sealed it off genetically at the 10% mark or wherever it is. We don't know exactly where it is. But wherever it is, they sealed us off. You don't want your slave to be anywhere near as smart as you. You, in fact, want your slave to be so decidedly inferior to you that you never have to worry about treating it like a slave. So they engineered us to be really clever to ourselves, but for them, we were smart enough to talk, take instructions, act with a little bit of ingenuity and self-reliance. They could turn things over to us and kind of let us take over and do it. They gave us just enough to be wonderful in our own eyes, but be pond scum relative to them. It's what they did. So, it's pretty clear in as much as that, and now understand with the idiot savants, for those of you that don't know the proof about this, idiot savants get some beam of light in the damage to the good 10. They get some beam of light and it will strike somewhere in the other 90%. You all saw Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man, remember? Well, they get it in math, they get it in music, they get it in sculpture, art, whatever, wherever it strikes. Now, if there's just one, we could say, well, that's a freak of nature. But we've had lots of them, lots of them. So we know that all of this is out there. It's in our heads. We just can't access it. We just can't use it. But if it wasn't in our heads, it wouldn't be in their heads. So we know that it happened. They have no idea how. Well, I say that the Anunnaki did it deliberately, and that makes sense to me. Next slide. Okay, mitochondrial DNA, late 1980s, you might remember this. In humans, over 99.99% of a cell's DNA is packed into the cell nucleus, with a small amount occurring outside the nucleus in small structures called mitochondria. That's these babies right here. They're about 16,000 base pairs long. Now, when you have a mixing and a mating, the DNA in the nucleus mixes. But with the mitochondrial DNA, it does not. Sperm doesn't have mitochondrial, eggs do. And so females pass it down intact generation after generation. Well, when this was figured out in the 70s, boy, the botanists and the geneticists said, great. Now we can go and find out if the split from the common ancestor was closer to 8 million years or closer to 5 million years. Remember that? We're going to now pin it down. It's going to be one or the other. We're going to figure it out. So they went out and they took the mitochondrial DNA of women all around the world, every race, every creed, every culture, every country, and they brought them back to the lab and they started working on them. And when the answers came in the late 1980s, it was not 8 million years ago. It wasn't 5 million years ago. It was way, way, way the heck down to 200 to 250,000 years ago, and that's all. We don't exist genetically beyond 200 to 250,000 years. And of course, needless to say, the anthropologists said, you guys are nuts. We've got these skulls showing, these bodies showing, these prehumans showing that we go back millions of years. What's the matter with you? And the geneticists said, we couldn't have been wrong that many times. Impossible. We'll do it again. And they have. They've done it. It always comes out the same. Outside 250,000 years ago. That's it. We're brand spanking new. Brand new on this planet. Now, there's still a lot of people, there's still a lot of people that will not accept that. A lot of people that will not accept that. But it is true, and it is becoming more and more acceptable, for as outrageous as it is. Now, not only do we know when we were created, we know where. Where? Because the oldest of us consistently kept coming in southern Africa. Next slide. And in fact, the cover of Newsweek in 1987 showed that if in fact there was an Adam and Eve, they were black. They would have to have been black. But of course they knew the flack they were going to catch, in the South at least, so they made the blacks look as white as they could. This guy looks almost as white as OJ, doesn't he? But the point is, in trying to have it both ways, they caught it coming and going, because you can imagine the letters to the editor after this issue. But the point is, it tells the truth. The oldest of us do come from southern Africa, and we definitely are 200 to 250,000 years old. And guess what else? That is just what the Sumerians say about us. That the Anunnaki created us around 200 to 250,000 years ago in southern Africa to dig their gold. What a coincidence. What a coincidence. Okay, next slide. Okay, what happens when a creature is born in the wild severely screwed up physically? What happens to it? Dies, right? Parents will kill it. They will not put that defect into the gene pool. You're looking at the great exception. You're looking at 28 of our most severe genetic defects, but we have 4,000 and counting. 4,000 and counting. Now, we're only 200, 250,000 years old. We shouldn't have one. We've got 4,000 and counting. How did it happen? Cutting and splicing process mistakes. Cutting and splicing, oops, made a mistake. Cutting, splicing, oops, made a mistake. They don't care. They're making a slave. They're not going to fix the mistakes. What do they care if it's 1 in 100 dies from the problems? If it's 1 in 10, they don't care. They're making a mistake. They're making a slave. But they know the numbers, like we have found out the hard way. If you let the population propagate naturally, those numbers go way down for each person. Right now, as we sit here, we average about 50 of the 4,000, each of us. And we have a mating with our mate. If we share any of those 50, then each of our offspring will have a 1 in 4 chance of expressing it. That's why you'll get mongoloids in the best of families, mongoloids in the lowest of families, and all around the world. And that's what genetic defects are. In the wild, you will get 2-headed calves and 6-legged goats. That's a sperm-egg misconnect. That's not something that you see steadily on and on. A little gem like spina bifida, which is not going to let you live to adulthood, nor is it going to let you reproduce if you do. What's that doing in a gene pool? It was all put there, folks. Put there. No question. Next slide. Okay, here we go, the chromosome match. It's kind of hard to see, comparison rather. Humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans right here. And you see how similar they are. And as we know that between humans and chimpanzees, there's 99% similarity in the DNA and 98% with gorillas. And it's like, oh, well, then we're just kissing cousins. That's as close as you can be. We're almost the same thing. Well, not really. Because we're talking about a 3 billion base pair genome. 1%, that's 30 million base pairs. That's a couple thousand strands of DNA. If you know what you're doing, that's a lot of change. But also understand that all higher animals, and never say this, share 50% and up. Squirrel, 50% and up. You see, so it isn't quite as astounding as it seems. But what we're looking at here is the Anunnaki have got themselves a real problem. And that problem is this. They come to Earth and they decide they're going to make the slave. They decide we're going to use this creature of Earth, let's say it was an Alma. They test the blood and what do they find? First thing, big problem, 48 chromosomes. All primates have 48 chromosomes. But they, the Anunnaki, have only 46 chromosomes. How do we know that? Because we have 46 chromosomes. We descend from primates, and yet somehow we lose 2 whole chromosomes. That's an awful lot of DNA. And somehow we're so much better than them. Well, they have 68 or something like that relative to them. But we don't. We have 46. So we know this was the result of the genetic engineering, and they had a problem. The Anunnaki did. What could they do? They had to, you know, how it works. There's 24 in sperm and egg, 23 sperm and egg. So you got to get the sperm and the egg to match up, one or the other, 23 or 24. Can you take out a chromosome from the creature of Earth, the 24, and still have a creature of Earth? No. Can you add a chromosome to yourself and still have an Anunnaki? Go up to 24 from 23? No. You got a real problem. It's an insoluble problem. And you need that because you got to get the first hybrid to get in the game of the genetic engineering. You got to get something alive that is a blending of you two to begin to work on it. So what can you do? How can you solve that problem? There's only one way, and boy is it smart. You go in and you look and you compare the chromosomes and you find 2 that can be fused and will take up one space but maintain the integrity of all the chromosomal material. You find a spot where you can fuse 2 to make 1, and now you've got all the material but taken up one place, and now you're ready to rock and roll. You with me? All right, let's look at the number 2 chromosome close up. They just went to the second one. They just looked down the row and they said, okay, this will work. Orangutan, 2 and 3. Gorilla, 2 and 3. Chimp, 2 and 3. Human. Uh-oh. Fusion. How long do you think it would take Mother Nature to do this? There's no clearer proof that we're genetically engineered just like they say we are. Next slide. And so, I think it's fair to say that everything we know is wrong, at least about human origins, that we were given life by the gods with a small g through the equivalent of a test tube, and that we were the hair-covered hominoids, and that our humanity emerged from that. Now, this is where I normally end it, and they tell me I'm running out of time, so I want to get to the new thing that I want to share with you. Oh, no, where did I? Oh, here it is. Because this is really exciting to me. On the 12th of this month, which was just recently, I received an email from a person who wants to remain anonymous. And this is what he said to me. He is a geneticist, a full-blown geneticist. And he says, "Dear Mr. Pi, I agree with your conclusions and will give you a few hints, if you wish, as a DNA deep throat. First, look up the huge discontinuities between man and the various apes for whole mitochondrial DNA, genes for the Rh factor, and human Y chromosomes, among others. Regarding number 3, the chromosomes, I refer you to K.D. Smith's 1987 study titled Repeated DNA Sequences of the Human Y Chromosome. It says most human Y chromosome sequences so far examined do not have homologs, which are similar sequences, on the Y chromosomes of other primates. Human female DNA does look somewhat ape-like, but not the male Y. This means that if we are a crossbred hybrid species, as you contend, meaning me, the cross had to be between a female ape-like creature, a creature of the earth, as the Sumerians said, and a male person from elsewhere, as I also contend." He goes on to say, "What the evolutionists do is find certain genes which look very similar between man and ape, then they make a tree of descent while ignoring those huge impassable abysses of difference elsewhere. Also, by certain methods of DNA dating, one can tell that numerous genes have been recently added to the human genome. If workers in my field were to say such things openly, we would be ostracized, as I also contend, and forced to live in a tent. Any work along these lines would be rejected without any form of appeal. So what can we do? Sincerely, DNA Deep Throat. Now, what this means, thank you, what this means is we win. We win. Because where one of these came from, more of these are going to come. As my profile rises higher, and I think, frankly, that I'm the only person out here pushing this genetic stuff that you're seeing like this, more of these are going to come my way. We're going to win. You've seen the evidence. Now, right now, we're getting our brains kicked out. We are getting our brains kicked out. That's why we're called the fringe. And the reason is we keep mounting these frontal attacks on the establishments. And every film that we produce, every photograph, every sighting, every testimony, every capture, every encounter that we have, and we throw at them with the best intentions. Our word is truth, is it not? Our word is, it's true. It's true. And their word is what? Liar. Liar. They dress it up. They say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're seeing. You made a mistake. It was swamp gas, whatever. They're basically standing there and saying, you're just a bunch of liars. We're right and you're wrong. And because it is our word against their word, our word truth, their word liar, their word wins. Day in, day out, year after year. It's very frustrating, is it not? Boy, it just annoys the heck out of me. But what this means is we're going to win in the end. Why? Because the genes say so. The genes back us up. And right now, this is not a field that you're very familiar with. And I've worked very hard to make this very simplistic so you could understand at least the fundamentals, and it's the same in my book. You need to be aware of this is because this is the back door, kids. This is the back. We're not going to storm them from the front. We've been doing it for years. They know how to deal with us. Our word against them, we're going to lose. But in this instance, the genetic end of it, what is it? It's their word against them. It's their research against them. They're going to lose. We're going to beat them with the genetic evidence. We got to beat them. We will beat them. We know we're right. We know they're wrong. They know they're wrong. They know they're wrong. We just have to get mentally tough and accept that this is a war. This is a fight. This is not, gentlemen, Marquis de Queensberry rules. This is a dog fight. This is a knife fight. And you all have got to get out there and proselytize. You have to familiarize yourself with these basics at least. And instead of throwing things at them that are going to bounce off like BBs off a barn door, you got to start throwing some darts. This stuff will do it. This will do it. We can win. We're going to win. Thank you. There's supposed to be planets at certain places of a certain size, and it all fits reasonably well except for the asteroid belt where there should be a planet, and there isn't. But there was Tiamat then, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto as a moon of Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and into that forming solar system at around 4 billion years ago, which we extrapolate and assume because all of them were still very plasmid, still very much lava-ish, able to pull moons out of themselves, and we know that the solar system formed at around 4.6 billion years ago, so at around 4 billion years ago would have been the time approximately when this would have happened. Okay, Nibiru comes in, and as it's a stray planet like the one we saw a few months ago being slung out of the binary star system on the news, we all saw that, probably something like that. It's captured by the gravitational pull of the large outer planets, swung around the sun, captured by the sun, and is caught in an elliptical orbit like a comet, moving clockwise as opposed to the counterclockwise circle where we came from, is in fact going to be found in Sumer, ancient Sumer. Modern-day Iraq, Tigris-Euphrates River, Zagros Mountains, the Fertile Crescent. And the Sumerians are the first great culture that we know to come out of the Stone Age. At around 6,000 years ago, they appear full-blown, boop, everything. over 100 of the first that we attribute to a high culture the Sumerians produced. Now, logic would tell you, and certainly the Darwinian paradigm of simplicity leading to ever more complexity would tell you that the first culture out of the Stone Age is going to come crawling out of the caves on bloody hands and knees. Are they not? But no. These guys come sailing out and start building beautiful cities and have education and law and everything. Next slide, please. They had the first great cities, the first great city centers, the first high-rise buildings, the first walls, the first roads, the first wheeled vehicles, the first ocean-going vessels, geniuses with water, first agriculture, first animal husbandry, math-based writing. And by the way, their mathematical system, called sexagesimal, based on the number 60, is better than ours for using very small numbers and very large numbers. And they kept time around the great year, 26,000 years. How'd they figure that out? Among other things. But in their writings, most of it is like these little hand things where it's just bills of lading. I sell you this. I'm buying that from you. It's like our paperwork. But they have a lot of them, about 5,000 of the 100,000 or more that we have, that have to do with stories of their cosmology, their cosmogony, their history, where we came from, how the solar system formed and all that. And that's what we're going to go over, what they had to say. Where did it come from? Well, originally when these things were being translated in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the translators would read what they'd have to say, it was like, oh, come on, forget about it. Put them in the myth. These are myths. They have to be myth. It can't be true. And they put it in the myth pile, which Alan was talking about, myth. So, Zechariah Sitchin, a man named Zechariah Sitchin in the 1950s gets the idea, wait a minute, how does the first culture get a myth? Who hands it to them? Good question. Why didn't anybody else think of that? So, he assumes it has to be a history. They have to be telling a history, which then later gets distorted perhaps as myth by later cultures, but the first one's got to be a history. So he goes into the myth pile with that attitude and comes out with 8 books at this point called the Earth Chronicles series, which I use as the basis for a lot of what you're going to see here now for a while. Okay, we're going to go over what the Sumerians had to say, boiled down. Part 4 of my book is basically the cliff notes to Sitchin's work. Any of you that have tried to read it, you know it's a slog at points. Okay, I tried to make it as easy as I could so at least you have the cliff notes to go in and try it again. All right, next slide. Here's what they say, that originally as the solar system was forming, there was the Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, and a big planet called Tiamat, right where the asteroid belt is now. And if you know about husbandry, first laws, first court systems, first literature, you name it, they had it. Well, everything except cable TV, maybe. I mean, they had it. They were great. They were a fantastic culture. And the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans come from their culture. Those cultures developed from what passes down from the Sumerians, or at least out from the Sumerians, I believe. Okay? So, one of the many things they had at first was writing. Now, this is what we're all taught. We're taught nothing about the Sumerians except that they invented writing. Again, they appear, boop, invent writing, boop, disappear, and that's it. History forgets about them. You never hear what they wrote. You never hear what they wrote. And you never hear how sophisticated they were because, again, it doesn't fit that paradigm. It's easier to just start with the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans and move on from there. Okay? What they had to say, next slide, in their writings, their writing, by the way, was cuneiform, very sophisticated.